Hello and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore, your host for this episode, coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show we have Dr. Michael Sapiro, a clinical psychologist practicing out of Boise, Idaho. I'm going to read you his bio here because I think it's helpful. Dr. Michael Sapiro is a clinical psychologist, Dharma teacher, meditation researcher, and former Buddhist monk. He is on faculty at Esalen Institute and is a fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dr. Sapiro teaches nationally on the art and science of transformation, expanded human capabilities, self-care, and meditation for personal and community growth. He is the founding teacher of Maitri Sangha, Boise, an integrated Buddhist community, and director of Maitri House Yoga, serving the community through integrating meditation practices, psychology, noetic sciences, and social justice. He can be found at maitrihouseyoga.com. That's spelled Maitri, houseyoga.com. This probably will not be the last time he's on the show. So thank you, Dr. Mike, for joining us. And I hope people are really interested in what we get into. We kind of get into how meditation, mindfulness, Buddhism intersects with psychedelia a little bit, the psychedelic research, brain imaging, etc., and much more. So hope you enjoy the episode. If you want to help us out, please leave us a review on iTunes or Facebook. If you want to help us financially, you can help us with a small monthly donation as low as $2 at patreon.com/psychedelics today. If you want to learn more about psychedelics, check out Navigating Psychedelics, our intro to psychedelics that is not really an intro. It's really what we wish we had in college. So please check that out at psychedelicstoday.teachable.com. And if you want to stay up to date, please join our mailing list over at psychedelicstoday.com. Thanks for listening. See you on the other side. Today on the show, we have Dr. Michael Sapiro, PsyD, joining us to talk about all sorts of stuff. So you've been around a lot of this material for a bit. You went to CIIS, is that right? Or Naropa, was it?
No, I went to John F. Kennedy University, but through my work with Institute of Noetic Sciences, had a lot of overlap with folks at CIIS, Sophia University, which was interpersonal. I can't remember actually the ITP before then.
Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, yeah.
That's it. That was it. Thanks.
I applied there. I decided against it after a bit, but yeah, it looked like an amazing program. So JFK University, is that where you did your PsyD?
Yeah, I got my doctorate at John F. Kennedy in the Bay, and got most of my research training actually at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, especially in consciousness or meditation research.
Cool. So, I guess to flesh out the story here, where are you from initially?
Oh, shoot, man. I grew up in Chicago, but spent a time in the Peace Corps in Thailand, lived in Portland for 6 years, the Bay, and now I've settled in Boise, Idaho. So I've been around. Most of my training in what we're going to talk about today really comes out of my work in the Bay area, especially the North Bay, Petaluma, San Rafael, Novato area.
Great. Now, can you talk briefly about Institute of Noetic Studies or Science?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be a part of that group. I've been consulting with them or assisting in their programs, and now I'm a fellow out there since about 2012. It was founded by an astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, who had a pretty profound experience coming back from the moon in 1973, I believe Apollo 14, and decided to study consciousness and transformation from a variety of scientific lenses. So took his own deep personal experience of transformation and applied it through the scientific lens. So they do an amazing amount of creative scientific work on psychic phenomenon, meditation experiences, altered states of consciousness, things like telepathy, clairvoyance, altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences. And my work over there really has to do with meditation research. So that's where I fit in. And that's how I also got in touch with a lot of psychedelic researchers. The crossover between psychedelic research and meditation research is really robust.
I've gotten a small discussion with somebody yesterday on on Facebook about psychedelics versus meditation. It's a funny conversation, right? He's like, meditation's just slow motion psychedelics. So I was like, well, and Stan Groff would sometimes say psychedelics are just non-specific amplifiers of mental process or psychic process. So it's like pretty much the same thing. You're saying the same thing. The process and development and its relation to the human organism is obviously very different, but both could be very helpful.
We have a lot of data, though, coming out of various neuroscience labs that meditative states, awareness-based meditative states, and the psychedelic states have a lot of crossover. The neural correlates are shown to be very similar, and the subjective experience is known to be very similar. I don't know how it wouldn't be. It's all within the human subject, right? And what it does in the brain, it's less interesting to me personally as a clinical psychologist than what it does in changing our perspective, our worldview, and our behaviors.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think perhaps a lot of that insight before we had too much data, brain imaging data on psychedelics, is why I was so interested in both meditation, yoga, psychedelics through my undergrad and beyond. Just so much interesting stuff there. So maybe we can talk about your professional practice in Boise.
Yeah, it's I call it a transformational psychology. It's really integrational based. So I integrate the Buddhist Dharma in the Thai forest tradition, which most people know from Jack Kornfield's lineage, Ajahn Chah back in the northeast of Thailand. And so I integrate the Buddhist Dharma, Western psychology, non-dual meditation and philosophy out of the Kashmir Shaivism tradition, and then Noetic Sciences, the science that we gain about consciousness and transformation, the science of knowing itself. So I integrate all of these into my practice. And these include looking at psychedelic phenomenon that happen to people who, one, might take actual psychedelics, and two, might have more psychic experiences, which psychedelics themselves encourage. And psychic experiences could be mediumship, channeling. It could be having altered states of reality while being awake and present, even without using plant medication or plant medicine. So I encourage my patients to really look at their lives as a holistic puzzle, a picture in which they might have had a lot of these experiences, but I want them to bring it forward in our work because they're pieces of the puzzle that could be important for their growth.
So you said Kashmir Shaivism. I've mentioned it only probably once on the show. I see a lot of kind of sloppy discussion around non-duality in psychedelic spaces. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly talk about Kashmir Shaivism, just because I think it's something, when people start talking about unity experiences or non-duality, they might go here for a tradition of people talking about these kinds of experiences.
What I had this conversation last night with a colleague. He's reading a book about near-death experiences, and the woman who had this experience came out with kind of a non-dual understanding of the universe and herself. And he wanted to know a little bit more how to apply this, but it's a really felt experience rather than one that's intellectual. It is a felt experience of it's almost a dissolving or a non-separateness, a non-two-ness. It's hard to say a oneness, because what happens when we start talking about oneness is people shoot for that concept. And they forget that in shooting for something, they're actually creating a natural duality. I want that state. So traditional non-dual philosophy from my practice comes from Kashmir Shaivism, which is northern Indian practice, and it's transmitted and taught to me by Richard Miller here in the States out of San Rafael Institute called IREST. And his work and his life is really deeply grounded in the Kashmir Shaivism tradition, which is a non-dual tradition that talking about the pure formlessness from which then everything arises. All phenomenon arise, including material matter, including thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, judgments, feelings, sensations. And all of that dissolves naturally back into a non-dual of very pure space. And we are both at the same time. We are both where we come from and the material that arises out of it. So psychedelics naturally lend themselves to that, because psychedelics is a disintegrating kind of process from which, if you integrate back into your life, you can carry both the formlessness and the form at the same time.
So, do you do therapy with people professionally? Do you mostly, like, what does your professional practice kind of look like on the day to day?
Yeah, as a clinical psychology, I have 20 to 28 patients a week. And as I said, we use a kind of an integration. The Buddhist Dharma points us toward how to be, how to act, how to speak, how to think. The non-dual tradition actually helps us rest in awareness itself, rest in being, where there's nothing to do, everything is whole and unbroken. And in that state of whole and unbrokenness, that's where we want to start identifying who we are with. Instead of the states and conditions of the mind, which always fluctuate based on external situations, internal states of mind, the non-dual space, which is a pure space of awareness itself, which is full of joy and well-being, is where I actually ask my patients to rest in. So we do the human work with the Buddhist Dharma and psychology, but we do our spiritual work in a place that's already pure and resting and full of ease, so that they can do both. Because like in psychedelics, you can have an amazing experience, but without integrating that into your life, it actually has no value in that sense, because you're not knowing how to move through the world with that new information. So my clinical work really integrates those two aspects of being, refining our humanity and our humanness while really sitting in that beautiful, restful place of being.
You're striking me as the next Jack Kornfield, but I'm sure that's probably not enough.
I wish. Probably not. Right. I had a chance to meet him in San Francisco once, and I actually am mentored by James Perez, who also was one of the co-founders of Spirit Rock.
Oh,
James
great.
is my personal mentor in the Dharma and a dear friend. Oh, being a Jewish Buddhist psychologist, sure, I wish I could be a Jack Kornfield, but I'll just take being the best version of myself.
Cool. Yeah, he led a 7-day breathwork and insight meditation retreat with Groff that I attended in New York years ago. I had never had such a great retreat. I'm sure. Yeah, well, that's something we can chat about offline. But so sure. Let's talk about your mission. So you've got a really specific dedication to what you're working on, and maybe we can get into that and how that looks, from here, like what you're up to.
Yeah, that'd be great. So my personal mission is, or at least, I've been doing this work for 20 some years at this point, and it's really solidified in the last few years, getting just a direction that I know I can be stable on in my work, in my own life. And it's around personal awakening for the sake of collective transformation. So again, my vision of my work is to enhance personal awakening in order to create collective transformation. So it's not enough for me to just help people awaken to their, deepest or best potentials. The end goal for me is actually helping communities, our states, our nation, and the world transform. And I take when I was in the Zen tradition for about 8 years, I took my bodhisattva vows very seriously, that we're doing this work for the realization of freedom for all beings. And so my work is kind of guided by that concept. But I start with personal awakening here in the moment with individuals or small groups.
That's really cool. We want to think like just one person becoming awake is enough. It's really, you're right, kind of about making healthy communities and, that radiating out, because without like interpersonal interaction, what is that one person really doing? Perhaps some subtle things, but We like to think more on the gross levels, right? Do you have any examples of like case studies of folks you've worked with or anything that you can share? Like, they're hooked on meth and, truck driver, and now they're like an organic farmer outside Boise teaching yoga.
That's a lovely one. Sure, that one. No, I don't have that story. Oh, it can be a lot less romantic than that. I work with all kinds of folks from military. I used to do a lot of work with combat veterans. I work with law enforcement agents. And then I work with community members and surgeons and lawyers, doctors. I work with mothers who have had traumatic experiences in birth, giving birth. And in each one of these cases, they're all bringing a variety of the human story. And in that variety, what it comes down to is there's something in their way of growing. And so there's kind of different levels that I'm working on. Am I working on stability? Someone who's just attempted suicide a few weeks before. They've come to me. They've just attempted suicide because of their past traumas were overwhelming to them and they haven't really worked them through or healed. So that's stability. Are they stable to really finding grounding in their life? Have they had a period where they're grounded in their life, they're making healthy decisions, and then you move on to thriving? Are they now actually expanding their worldview? Are they changing their behavior in ways that encourages growth and transformation for them and everyone they touch and talk to in their life? So are they becoming a beacon of life themselves? So I kind of work on those three levels of being: stability, grounding, and then expanding or thriving. And so I have probably too many stories, but this is the overall arching theme that I've seen in all my work. And so I really meet a person where they're at on any of those levels. And then from there, we start expanding. And I can tell you, any person who's working on expanding and thriving becomes a beacon for other people, because you start treating people differently. In the stores, you start greeting people as other beings of light. And I don't just mean that in the New Age sense, we're all light and love, but really seeing the wholeness in other beings, you start greeting that. When you see it in yourself, you can't help but see it in other people. And you naturally start seeing other people's conditionings. Because once you work on your own, you can naturally see other people getting caught in theirs. So I won't give a specific example, but really this is the process of growth and transformation that emanates outward toward everyone. And so when I lead my Sangha, we always end the Sangha by saying, now take this work we've learned about and apply it to your neighbors, apply it to yourself in the community, so that everybody you touch gets a sense of this ease you've now found yourself having. So, and I also apply really important concepts out of the social justice movement, because the more you see your own suffering, where it comes from in the conditions, it's hard not to see that in others, but it's also hard not to commit to others' well-being. And so I get into the realm of social justice, because once you start transforming, how can you not help communities that are systematically institutionalized and marginalized? You just have to put effort toward that. So our Sangha and my work is really oriented always toward that collective transformation. And that's one of the processes we get there.
What is the word Sangha? My impression is community.
It's traditionally a group of monks who learned with the Buddha. Sangha is a community of people who are gathered together, taking refuge in one another to grow personally and as a group. And so you would meet in the forest, you'd meet with your teacher, and then that would be disseminated out through your own behavior and actions into the world. So Sangha is a community in which we take refuge to learn the Dharma, or any teaching, really, any mystical or transformational teaching. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And so do you lead a community, or do you consider your whole practice part of your Sangha, or how does that?
I founded a Sangha in Boise, Idaho. It's called My Tree Sangha Boise. And it is steeped in the Thai forest tradition, but we bring in all of the things we're talking about. I bring in psychedelic science because it it shares a different part of the human experience. And I bring in Noetic Sciences, I bring in psychology, but we're grounded in the traditional Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah, a lot of how you phrased Sangha made me kind of recall various experiences I've had where in a deep community where we're doing mutual support and introspection and inner work, largely in holotropic breathwork spaces, but some psychedelic ones as well. It's a really interesting bond, like this mutual support, mutual aid, and teachers that we can pull from. It's an interesting thing that can kind of develop in between people when they're trying to heal. And I think you're right about like once we're trying to make ourselves more whole, a lot more that beacon analogy really worked for me, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know, I believe it was Ananda, one of Buddha's main disciples, came to Buddha and goes, after reflection, it seems like holy friendship is half of the spiritual life. And Buddha said, no, don't think that way. Holy friendships are the whole of the spiritual life. That's the Buddha himself talking about the importance of community, because we're doing this work in community. We're doing it. I was a monk, and it was difficult at times. Everything in me comes out. The silence and stillness is a mirror for everything, all of our conditionings, our longings, our desires, our aversions. But I've never been as challenged as when I'm with my own family. Okay. Like that's when I have to really apply the Dharma consistently. So in relationship is the best place to do our work. And I found my own marriage to be the best place for me to do my work and actually apply the principles that I've been learning. So the Buddha knew that this is the human community is the best place to do our work. And so once you start doing that, how can you not take care of other people? Naturally, you start taking care of other people. And I think that's true for the psychedelic experience. People have such a deep connection to nature once they come out, when they're in it and they see the profundity of a tree. They might not have noticed that tree or a bend in a river, but it becomes alive. It takes on an actual, I wouldn't maybe persona, but what I'm saying is the life force becomes noticed. When you come out of the psychedelic experience or even a mindfulness experience being with a tree or a leaf, you start taking care of the environment differently than when you went in. It's the same concept.
Right. And we now have data, I believe, like people have known this for a long time, but we have data supporting greater environmental concern and stewardship after psychedelic experiences, mm-hmm. something along those mm-hmm. lines. And I think it seems to go hand in hand with meditators too. I've not seen that data, but I've known a lot of meditators.
We have data on a virtual reality practice where you go in and you spend time with trees, the forest and individual trees. And the people who spend mindful time with these trees in virtual reality end up using less paper than those who didn't have that kind of personalized experience. So there is good data that suggests from psychedelic realm and VR that people who are consciously and intentionally interacting with things outside of themselves have greater care for those people or parts of nature. And because it breaks down barriers, and we see that we're all in this together. We're all actually fundamentally the same material. So if I hurt myself, I'm hurting the world. If I hurt the world, I'm hurting myself.
Right. Yeah. The way I've been viscerally talking about that is like you're not necessarily around oneness, but like, as the environment goes, so does your ability to eat, breathe, and drink and live. So like, I guess kind of a more gross way of talking about it, but in a way it's just perhaps more communicable to most people. But yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And I think that's going to be one of the bigger things, hopefully, coming out of the psychedelic movement is more greater and greater levels of environmentalism and global stewardship.
And I feel that my hope is about social justice as well, that the psychedelic movement increases our ability to love others and to expand our own worldviews to incorporate them, but also to see very clearly how systems which are made up actually are influencing tangible reality. And so, because in psychedelics, those boundaries dissolve. And you see, very early on in my life, I started psychedelics at 15. Imagine being a 15-year-old and having your worldview broken open, your sense of self and others totally dissolve and shift. And I'm not suggesting anybody listening give a 15-year-old LSD at all, but I'm saying that was my path. And because of that, I started to see the systems that I were living in and the supervisors and bosses. And I saw them making it was all made up. And I was like, why do I have to listen to this? Like, what's the truth in this? Which made me a pretty bad employee and supervisee at times, honestly. But on the other hand, it broke the mold. I didn't have to follow what was set for me. Psychedelics gave me that understanding. But the Buddhism that I was growing up in also, about when I was 18, started increasingly showing me the importance of taking care of our planet, other people who are suffering. So both of those together are a really important shift in our worldview about systems not being real, but also our responsibility to take care of people in the systems.
Yeah. I call it the reggae world or Rasta world kind of gives us that quote, Babylon system, the Babylon, burn down Babylon, all that kind of stuff. And that's, how I phrase it often, psychedelics or meditation can give you deep insight into this Babylon system that is, fake, made up, hurting people. And what do we do? It's kind of like that Matrix moment. Like, this thing is just totally fraudulent in a lot of cases. Helpful because sometimes people can get food, but what do we do in the wake of that? And these are big questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting anarchy. These systems are important and they're in place, but how do we operate within them, and how do we support people clearly not being benefited or getting resources? And psychedelics and meditation both have the ability to show us that, but we need a system ourselves. We need a way of being that then we can rely on in daily interactions, because psychedelics don't give us that, and meditation itself doesn't give us, which is why in the Dharma we have right speech, right effort, right action, right livelihood, ways of guiding us in our daily interactions within ourselves and with others. So that's a piece that I see missing a lot in kind of the consciousness hacking realm we're in. Let's just get really quick experiences that blow our minds, but they don't really say, well, how about for the next 20 years, how are we going to integrate this and change ourselves? Right.
Which is a conversation we should be having. So
that's what I'd like to be a part of, helping those folks after they've been hacked. Here's how you rebuild, integrate, and move forward with a dedicated practice to what you just explored, whether that be dancing, drumming, meditation, ritualized, whatever it is for yourself. So
let's talk about what that might look like. So right now you have, X number of clients per week, and there's limited time, right? Like therapists, people doing therapy have just limited capacity per work week. And how do you go bigger? Like, you've obviously built this Sangha. It sounds like you're traveling a lot teaching.
I wanted to move back. I love Boise. I wanted to move after I finished my fellowship. I wanted to move back to the Bay, and Richard Miller and Cassie Veaton of IONS were like, stay there and do your work. One, there's 1 million Jewish Buddhist psychologists in the Bay. Like, you're not going to offer anything different. But two, do your work so that I can grow. I needed to continuously grow as well. So doing my individual work has given me so many deep insights into human experience. So I would never give up doing my one-on-one work, because that's where I learn the daily minutia of being human and how people struggle in it, and how I can support them, because I know they'll treat their families better, their communities better, themselves better. But I also lead a large Sangha here in Boise. So that reaches sometimes up to 100 people a couple times a month. Usually we have about 40, 50 people come. We practice meditation. We talk together. But I also teach at Esalen Institute. I go around the country leading retreats and workshops for organizations as well as for yoga centers and meditation retreats. And I'm collaborating with incredible frontier researchers and spiritual teachers who their work is reaching out to thousands and thousands, if not more. I just heard the mindful self-compassion, which one of my good colleagues is working in as a lead teacher, has reached over 200,000 people with their work since 2011. That is enormous. Huge. That's such good reach. So we're doing the work, and my part is individual and groups, and then, really supporting teachers in the field, scientists in the field.
That's great. And what does it look like working with colleagues? Like, is it like, are you coordinated with any folks, or is it largely connections made at conferences or casual things?
Oh, I can't stand conferences. I can't do it. I get so restless. I like being with people doing the work. It looks a lot of different ways. So through the Institute of Noetic Sciences, I've been in touch with a lot of psychedelic meditation researchers. So sometimes I join them in their studies, or I'm co-facilitating the intervention in a study. I also teach a lot with these folks in the field like Cassandra Veaton from Institute of Noetic Sciences, and a lot of folks who are in the field doing both science and application. My goal is to do both. I want to be a part of the scientific community and those who are applying it. And so what it looks like is I'm actually more supportive of their work than I ask them to be of mine, because I love learning. I love being of support, especially to strong women too. My goal is to not have to be the lead, but to be a support of someone who's truly an amazing leader. And I often choose really strong women leaders because, one, they don't have enough support and they need more, and we need the balance, but also because I'm constantly learning. So I always said, when people ask me how did I get where I got, I said I scrubbed a lot of, when I lived in the Zen center under my teacher, I scrubbed a lot of toilets. And with Cassie at Ions, I carried a lot of crayons. I was willing to just assist, to learn, to lend myself where I could. And over the years, I've become a leader who's now giving other people a chance to assist. And it's a real humbling thing to carry someone's crayons and art supplies and see their greatness and just be in their presence. So my biggest gratitude is to all these teachers and leaders who I just get to be in their presence.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that's a lot of the ways my teacher taught me too. Just hang out, assist as much as you can, wash the dishes, clean up the rooms, and you get to be there and you get to really soak it all up, and it's amazing. Humbling too. It's very humbling. I get to assist Alyssa Eppel and Dan Siegel this year out at 1440 doing some awareness and stress resiliency work. Alyssa is a good friend. We're teaching together at Esalen. She's like, I'm so sorry. You could only be assistant this year, and I can only pay you as assistant. I'm like, I'd carry your coffee all weekend just to be around you and Dan, because of how passionate they are, how brilliant they are, how much their work influences well-being for the world. I don't mind being an assistant, even if we're teaching together as co-teachers. There's something so gratifying about being around world changers. So anybody listening, I encourage you not to think about becoming the world changer, but what would it take to be in the presence of a world changer? And that alone will change your life. Yes. And, sometimes it is washing toilets or whatever, carrying heavy bags for them. But
that's right.
The benefit is huge. It cost-benefit analysis over grad school might be higher. So consider that. You never know. I don't want to dissuade too many folks from going to grad school because we need you.
No, do it also. We do need that too. I'm so glad I did.
Yeah, I wish it was more affordable. If it wasn't going to go into crippling debt, I would have probably done it.
Let's not talk about that right now.
Right. So, what does the situation look like in Boise right now in terms of Buddhism and psychedelic research or anything like that?
Boise is surprisingly and refreshingly conscious. I am so glad to live here. I don't want people to move here. So if you're listening, you're thinking about it, we want you to visit, but please don't stay. It's growing too big. It's a very, what do you call it, a red state, politically speaking. But Boise is a pocket of really conscious folk who are doing their work in the community. It's very community oriented. We have actually, I think, 6 or 7 Buddhist Sanghas, a couple Vipassana, Tibetan, Thich Nhat Hanh's lineages here. And these are folks who have been dedicated for many years, 30, 40 years of their lives to this practice. We have folks who are psychic. We have people who do channeling and mediumship here. We have people who are doing consciousness research. It is a really awesome pocket. And Idaho itself is one of the most gorgeous places. So nature is our teacher. Nature is Dharma. And we are surrounded by the Dharma, by nature. So within 15 minutes, I can be in the foothills and spending time by myself. I think we have 1.6 million people or something in Idaho, and it's a very large state. So you have a chance to really be quiet in nature, which is our teacher as well. So Boise itself is a great place to bring, because we're thirsty here. We're thirsty for this kind of transformation.
I lived in Utah for a little bit, and that dynamic between being in a super red state with like some really curious people in certain pockets really made it almost more vibrant. So that contrast really was very interesting. You know, as cool as it is to live in San Francisco, it's just part of the fabric of the thing, as opposed to more vibrant colors, perhaps.
Yeah, the contrast is really, it's a well put. There is a big contrast here, and at the same time, we all live together and live pretty well together. The psychedelic field here, there are pockets of groups that do private work. It is really appreciated. We have a long history of indigenous and native cultures that bring in the love of plant medicine, not just psychedelic, but berries and roots and plants. And so people who have lived here a long time, you can't help but have that infused in your own consciousness. And so the psychedelic community actually, even though it's underground, is a thriving one because of the nature of our work in expanding consciousness here. Mm-hmm.
So a thing we haven't talked, we just recently had a full episode on holotropic states and astrology. Mm-hmm. We haven't dug too much more into like psychical experiences, and that's kind of core to ions, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah. So how do you like to talk about that stuff? Like I'm no stranger to it personally. I just don't raise it on the show too much. But how do you mean
psychic phenomenon, or
right? Sure, and channeling, etc. And perhaps how it relates to ions or your work or anything you want to maybe go with.
Well, my personal work or my clinical work is about the human experience. And when you look at surveys about across cultures and within America, do people have psychic experiences? Do they have telepathy, synchronicities, clairvoyance? Are they being talked to by spirits or ancestors? Do they have access to? Most people actually say yes, they have. How many times do you know when someone's calling that who it's going to be, or you just think of this person you haven't thought of in months and they call the next moment? This is a very normal human experience. Dean Radin, the chief scientist at Institute of Noetic Sciences, talks about these states as super normal. They're normal, but they're super normal in the way that you actually have to cultivate them. All of us have access to these states. In the Yoga Sutras, they're called the siddhis, siddhis. They're supernormal powers we get from extended meditation practice. The Buddha himself talked about these abilities, but he was very clear that you don't covet them, you don't practice for them. They're side effects, that you will get lost in and find your ego being boosted. Well, look at this, I can levitate, or look at this, I can predict the weather. He's like, good for you, get back to your practice, basically. And, so I'm a skeptic, which is funny because I work at a very far out place that studies kind of, altered ways of being. But I've had some experiences myself. Most people do. The way I work with it was allow it into the room. What's a person's experience? Do they deny it? Do they disbelieve it? Do they doubt it? Do they encourage it? Do they cultivate it? Where are they in their relationship to these states, which are just a human experience that I want to allow to be okay to have in the room or in a group? I particularly don't work with them. So if somebody comes to me and says, my ancestors are talking to me, I refer them to someone who does that work, because it's not my specialty. So, but I do encourage people to accept them and even cultivate them if they're interested in doing so.
Reading something in Ralph Metzer's new book last night about a gentleman, I think he was a psychiatrist who was running the ward at some hospital a little outside of San Francisco, where people were pretty much lifers at a psychiatric facility. They're not going anywhere. And he was a little bit more compassionate than they were in the 60s. He said, let's just make them comfortable in their madness. Not saying hearing voices means you're mad, but yeah, that idea of denying your experience, I think could really trigger things. And are those really my ancestors, or am I just having this like daily struggle trying to say, no, that didn't happen. I'm normal, and like over and over, versus this thing, like, how do we make you more accepting of your experience and not being kind of two minds? So I found that really helpful.
It's important to differentiate, to learn as a clinician how to help a patient or a student differentiate between psychosis and psychic, between energetic flow and mania, because they both can be true. A lot of shamans that I have worked with actually have diagnoses of schizophrenia. And for them, it becomes really important, and knowing that line where they're in a psychic state versus when they're heading over to psychosis or psychotic state, because they can be in both. They've had both experiences. They obviously want to stay in one realm without tripping too far into another. There's a really good documentary called Crazy Wise that touches upon spiritual emergence issues. How do you know where it's, you're becoming a healer versus becoming psychotic, right? Shelley Scammell, I think, and Cassie Veaton have a book for APA that are about spiritual competencies, helping clinicians learn how to differentiate between psychosis and psychic, basically, because we don't have that in our field. We're not taught how to do this work, but it's essential because people come in hearing ancestors, and we have to figure out, is this actually a gift and something they want to harness, or is this something we want to, that's not adaptive and it's destructive? So that's part of my work as well, working on spiritual emergence issues. Stan Groff has a whole history in teaching trainers about that. Cassie Veaton does a good job. And Ralph Metzner, who you just mentioned, my guiding book is called The Unfolding Self. I use this work often to guide my work at helping people learn the metaphors of transformation, where they may be stuck and where they may have growth.
Yeah, that's excellent. One of the things we bump, so I haven't dug too deeply into spiritual emergence other than Groff's books. My partner in Psychedelics today has taken a certification, I guess, from Emma Bragdon, who's an interesting character, and the training that she put together around it looked really good. The thing that is always the ambiguous question is, how do we know if we should refer somebody to a hospital or to go on meds versus, hey, let's stick this out for 80 days or something, see what happens before putting you on meds. That's the biggest crux in that conversation. And it's hard to pin down an answer, right?
it's not one answer. And my initial gut response is training. Get training and exposure to these circumstances with someone who has experience, whether that be a guide or a senior therapist. I mean, I have a doctorate and I'm licensed, so I spent many, many years training in this, and then spending time with people who do spiritual emergence work, and then reading Cassie's book and developing my own competency so that I can sit with the patient. And I'm actually called in often in Boise when other clinicians are seeing a kind of spiritual emergence where the patient's having sense of unity consciousness, is touching on dissolving the self and becoming really a part of the grand scene, but they can't be a dad. How can they be a dad in that state? And do they need hospitalization and grounding or stabilization? Or can they be encouraged to ground themselves? And so I get called in to do consultation on really looking at the differences. I can't answer it on the show. It wouldn't be ethical to give tips, because people need training for this. But there are signs and symptoms you look for where you're going, oh, this is destructive. This is unhealthy. They need stabilization versus, this person doesn't need hospitalization. They need to learn how to ground and integrate and stay stable in themselves while exploring these greater regions of the universe.
Cool. And that's helpful because you also did mention resources people can go to dig deeper on that. So thank you for
You're
that.
welcome.
A tangential thought. I don't know how this relates to anything other than your personal background, but as we were talking about Buddhism earlier, I had this interesting thought about the relationship of Buddhism to Judaism. And there's something built into Judaism. I forget the term for it, but it's about making the world a better place, not necessarily like in the Jesus way, but like, let's work together to like make this place a little healthier, a little happier. I think. I could be wrong, but I don't know. Can you speak to that relationship at all?
There's a good book, The Jew and the Lotus, and that's out there. I still own it. I left Judaism around 16. Mm-hmm. I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. I'm a third generation survivor. I didn't feel connected to Judaism. First, I lived in a very anti-Semitic part of Illinois, very evangelistic Christian. I'd have good friends taking me to lunch, telling me why I'm going to hell. All right. So you can imagine there's a lot of internalized anti-Semitism I had to work through. And then my grandmother, who's an Auschwitz survivor, it just was really hard to be around because of severe PTSD. So I unfortunately pushed away from Judaism, and I found Buddhism very early on. I did psychedelics very early in my teenage years, and then found Buddhism around 18. And that spoke much clearer to me, and it was more direct. It's something I could practice with on a daily basis, although I know Judaism has those practices too. I'm sharing all this personal information because this is a part of the process we all go through about really coming out of systems that were given to us and finding those that work better for who we are. I can't speak to this point to any philosophy or theology out of Judaism because I let it go very early on.
Yeah, no worries at all.
But I do know the culture of Judaism, being Jewish, generally to me means thinking about social justice and civil rights. That piece is very true to me. And a lot of Jewish Buddhists spent, like Bernie Glassman before he died, spent a lot of time being oriented towards social justice and community development.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, and there has been a long-standing overlap for sure. So Jew in the Lotus, I'll check that out.
Yeah.
Really curious. Yeah. Cool. So we've got a bunch of time left. So where do we want to go?
Nice.
Maybe something we haven't touched. Maybe 13, 15 minutes.
Oh, lovely. Great. I'm just looking at some notes here and thinking what might your listeners really be excited about. And I think what would be awesome to talk about is really the overlapping personal experience of psychedelic states, altered states of reality and consciousness, and that which meditation produces as well. I think that was your original kind of interest in having me on the show, was as a meditation teacher, researcher, and also being a part of the psychedelic community. what are the overlapping kind of pieces there.
Yeah, let's do that. That sounds great.
So Institute of Noetic Sciences did a study called The Future of Meditation Research. It's not just a study, but it was a whole program. We found in the meditation research field that we were really just looking at one kind of piece of the benefit of meditation or mindfulness, which was like reducing anxiety and depression, creating a sense of well-being, really just, looking at it clinically, which thank goodness it became that way, because we can bring meditation into the VA. We can bring it to hospitals now. But there were a whole field of experiences that researchers were missing. And so we did a survey of about 1,200 people worldwide in their meditation experience. We just published this paper in PLOS. What we found was that well over half of the people experience psychic phenomena, mystical experiences, terrifying experiences like a dark night of the soul, like Willow B. Britton is looking at over at Brown University. And this correlates or overlaps so well with the psychedelic experiences. So meditators either in retreats or in personal practices have psychic phenomenon arise. They see clearly, they hear clearly things that aren't present. They have intuition. They can read people's minds. They have mystical experiences like unity consciousness or relationships with nature. And all of those are found in psychedelic experiences, including terrifying dissolving of the self and ego dying, like Catherine MacLean would talk about. So both of those, meditation and psychedelic experiences, point to the same kind of both unity and dissolving of the ego at the same time. That's something I bet you have a lot of interest and experience in, especially interviewing all the incredible folks you do.
Right. Yeah. There's no end of interesting conversation around that stuff and, what it means. There's this Groff analogy around ego dissolution. I think he was on the Aubrey Marcus show or something, talking about this Kafkaesque story about like how safe can the mole be? How many like the mole can build his home and be secure from the outside, but what if somebody attacks him? So he's got to build one exit, two exits, three exits in case they figure it out. And it's kind of like the bunker people in northern Idaho, right? Like how many prep plans can we make, and does that actually help us? And like reframing ego and like, you don't equal ego. Ego is just a helpful part of you. Perhaps a
yes, that's right.
But yeah, it's not something to kill all the time, but it's something to keep in healthy relationship,
that's right.
Which I think the Buddhist tradition helps with.
Absolutely. We're not killing our ego in that sense. We're actually learning how to make it an ally. To bring it forward, man, we could talk about that for an hour, how my work and how I also help people even make their anxiety into an ally. Instead of pushing it. Anxiety has a lot of wisdom, actually. Saying, hey, dude, like, be careful of this. I'm worried about these things. If we can take the dysregulated nervous state out of it, it's actually quite important information to be like, I do want to think about that. I want to consider it. I want to be nervous and dysregulated to a place where I'm panicked and I can't function. So how do we hear the wisdom in anxiety? How do we hear the wisdom in ego?
You're right. We could go on for hours on that, man.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And that gets me excited.
Yeah, like just the feelings, like we've evolved these feelings in this wildly complex and helpful nervous system and body that, these signals that we get can be helpful if we figure out where, how to get into right relationship with them. And
that's right.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like even fear, not even just anxiety, but just basic fear. Maybe that's something psychedelic people can learn from. Like obviously there's a lot of fear right now. My girlfriend and I are both reading Trump books right now. Like, she's reading Fear, and I'm reading the one that was about the first 100 days or so. Fire and Fury or something. Outrageous. And so like, of course that goes, how do we want to relate to the future? How do we want to relate to American politics in the wake of this craziness? And, given the ecological crisis, we've got to think about a lot of things. And
I look to my teachers to do that, who have been deeply grounded in the nurturing space of awareness while their human experience arises. Holy shit, what's happening? But I am not in a state of dysregulation. I actually can be calm and at ease, even though I'm afraid, even though simultaneously I'm totally nervous or upset or angry. And psychedelics also give us that. We need to be mindful about integrating what we learn in the psychedelic state into our ordinary waking consciousness, just as we do in meditation. And so both of those states, we see ourselves very clearly. We get messages, whether they're from the earth or from spirits or from guide or from our own wisdom. Psychedelics and meditation provide that. But then we learn to shed the messenger. We let the messenger pass on. Anxiety, fear, those gruesome images while we're in psychedelic states that provide something of value. Those messengers pass on, but we keep the message.
Right, absolutely. I think an obvious example of somebody who's been doing this work for ages and ages, Thich Nhat Hanh. Clear example of a Buddhist who's been wildly active working on causes that I would say most people in the psychedelic space would care about. Is Thich still alive? Do you know anything?
He is. Okay. I think he's in the process of dying. He returned home. Mm-hmm. I think there was a Time article about him just recently. I know he was in Thailand for a while. I think I was there at the same time when I was on my own retreat. Talking about death and our acceptance of death could be a whole other show too. Catherine and I could do a wonderful show for you on that. But I think what my message is and why I'm on the show is because I'm always about personal awakening. How can meditation and psychedelics lend themselves to being the best version of ourselves while committing to others' well-being? Remember, that's really what I'm so passionate about. And so psychology and meditation and psychedelics all lend themselves to really showing us conditions that we are habituated to, we're living in, but that start dissolving when you look at it closely and you become the space in which those things happen, rather than you become reactive to those things happening. And, psychedelic therapy, you're kind of sitting on a couch, blindfolded with music, and you're in it. You're deeply in it. You're not getting out of it. The guide is like, go through it, go through it, go through it. Because, and that's what I do in my sessions my therapy sessions, people are bringing up this deep conditional wounding and information and data that they want to sex themselves numb. They want to drug themselves numb. They want to overeat. They want to kill themselves because it's so overwhelming. But what we're learning in meditation and in psychedelics is you can sit with that dark material and you can learn something from it and you can grow past it. You can outgrow the messenger, but keep the message again. And psychedelics and meditation are really good tools for transformation for that exact purpose.
Saw a Buddhist meme yesterday, something along the lines of, if you don't like what you see when you close your eyes and go inward, sit with it until you do. It's kind of very Zen.
And that being said, if there's clinical issues that are coming up, because there can be something that happens in the Buddhist world, just sit with it and it'll go away, or you'll integrate it. I'm talking about doing the work it takes in therapy and in meditation and in psychedelics together. There's a really important book by David Trevelyan, I think that's how I say his last name, that James Beres is teaching his own students. Let me look that up just so I get the title right. Sure. For your listeners. And Willoughby Britton is working with him as well. Let me see this real quick. It's about trauma and mindfulness. It's really trauma-sensitive mindfulness. That's what it's called, by David Trevelyan and Willoughby Britton. It's an important book for understanding that not all the material that comes up in your work actually should just be sat with. You have to do the trauma work sometimes. It's the same thing with fundamentalist churches who tell you if you have mental health problem, you're a sinner. You're not praying hard enough. There are Buddhist teachers that say you're not a good meditator if you can't resolve everything by sitting. And that is not a healthy outlook at all. So I want to make clear that all that material will come up, and sometimes we actually need teachers, guides, or therapists to help us work through those issues, because sitting or psychedelics alone are not the answer. It shows you clearly what your material is, but it doesn't show you how to work with it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's kind of the medieval attitude, right? Like, tough it out. It's not really help. It doesn't work in all cases. Sometimes maybe, but we have to understand that if we are choosing to be more compassionate and helpful to our fellow humans and Earth, perhaps let's not just do this tough it out thing. Let's help each other.
Yeah. That's the other side of, there is a part of that. You sit with it, you watch it, and the other side is let's nurture it. Let's be soft and receptive to it, and let's actually love it and do the work that it takes to heal it, because sometimes just looking at it over and over is actually more terrifying and more dysregulating than it is to work through it. So that's why a skillful teacher, a skillful guide, and a skillful therapist will integrate everything we've been talking about. A good Buddhist teacher will see, this is a student I need to refer for therapy. A good shaman guide will see, this is psychosis. This isn't ayahuasca talking at this point. This is something that needs actual medical attention. We have to be trained enough to take all of these perspectives in if we're going to do this work, which is why my transformational psychology, I think, is so useful, because it integrates Western therapy, Western medicine, Eastern philosophy, and the shamanistic practices all together, because each one has a part to play in our growth and transformation.
Outstanding. That's a great note to stop on. So any closing thoughts before we wrap here?
I always just encourage people, listeners, students, to be open, curious. If they're just in the psychedelic world and they just think mushrooms solve everything, what might Buddhism or yoga philosophy or Western psychology have to offer to the psychedelic experience? And on the other side, if you're a therapist listening what might meditation and psychedelics have to offer your patients or even yourself for your own growth? I'm asking every person in their own kind of field to be open and curious about what others can bring to the table that we can integrate into our practices for the sake of personal awakening in order to create collective transformation.
Absolutely.
That's my, yeah.
And what's your website?
mytreehouseyoga.com. It was made 1 billion years ago. I don't update it. I just don't have time. But you can find me on Facebook on Maitri Sangha Boise. Maitri is Maitri, Sangha Boise. mytreehouseyoga.com is my website. I'm always open to taking emails and talking with more folks anytime.
Great. Well, Dr. Michael Sapiro, thanks for your time on Psychedelics Today. Until next time.
Thanks so much. Take care.
And there you have it, Dr. Michael Sapiro. Quite the guy, quite the background. When I started to chat with him a few months ago, I was just super jealous of his credentials and the organizations he gets to work with. That was kind of, in a lot of ways, my dream in my undergrad was to work with groups like ION, CIS, Teach at Esalen, etc. So, really fascinating to see what that looks like in another person's shoes and another person's experience. And it was just really great chatting with him. I hope you all enjoyed it. A thought from the end of the talk there about, if you think mushrooms fix everything, great, but perhaps be more curious. Consider the history. Like Huxley was super into Vedanta Hinduism, or Vedanta branch of Hindu philosophy or Indian philosophy, which is really amazing stuff. Leary, Metzner, and Ram Dass were obviously very into meditation and kind of a hybrid Hindu psychedelic philosophy that they kind of cooked up on their own during the Millbrook days, and that obviously went in a bunch of different ways for folks. So meditation, various philosophies from various parts of the world, and other practices might really help round out your mental health, how much you enjoy life, etc. Something came up from a Joseph Campbell movie, or no, you know what? I started reading Hero with a Thousand Faces, and one of the lines was, what happens when the hero returns is that life flows again. You kind of see this story where like food gets blocked from coming to the village, or, you know, XYZ happens and people are dying and life is stuck or fleeting, and the hero makes that life flow again. So consider that, you know, what is there something going on that's restricting the flow of life in your experience of life? You know, maybe just check that out. Be curious about what's going on there. Curious about your relationship to the world and more. So again, thanks to Dr. Michael Sapiro from Boise for joining us today. Really hope to have him on again. Really fascinating dude. And yeah, if you want to support the show, please check out Navigating Psychedelics. We've got a great course built out. It has tons of content there about how to be safer in the drug world, psychedelic world, how to prep for a trip, execute, and then land from a trip. You will have far more knowledge than your peers for the most part, unless you're a psychedelic researcher, after you take this class. This is the class we wish we had in college. It would have made us a lot more functional and probably would have saved some people from going to jail. Not me, but a lot of friends did end up getting in trouble, and we could have saved them a lot of time, and, you know, not to mention all of the weird spiritual quests folks were on that perhaps were very detrimental to their lives. So this is a really grounded way of looking at all that stuff with a good scientific grounding, and it comes with 12 masterclasses from various experts around psychedelia, talking about things like integration, microdosing, ayahuasca, and more. Plenty of stuff in there to dig into, and I hope you do check it out. So this is Joe Moore signing off from Psychedelics Today. We'll see you on the next episode.